That first reading in the Psalm 139, I believe, is similar to it. It says that before you were in the womb, I knew you. Before you were in your mother's womb, I formed you. To me, that's always been a point of serious meditation. God knew me before I was even formed in my mother's womb, and then he created me in my mother's womb. We all can say that. God only does what's good and right. And if he had to make the decision to create you and me individually, then God is very conscious of who we are, where we are, and what we're doing. And God always does things with a purpose. Your life and my life have a purpose. And God needs us to fulfill that purpose. We're not as great as Jeremiah the prophet or any other of the greats in the scriptures, yet nonetheless, they were formed just like you and I were formed. And God does things with a purpose. And I think that's certainly worthwhile meditating on today. In the second reading from St. Paul, it's a reading that's commonly used at weddings. It's a beautiful hymn to love. And we're also familiar with it. You know, that love is not rude. Love is not self-seeking. Love is not prone to anger. But on the contrary, love is kind. Love is joyful. Love is filled with concern for the other. And all those things are necessary in a marriage, but they're necessary in every one of our lives. That are the great call is to love. And it says at the end that we're given the gifts of faith and hope and love. We get those gifts in the sacrament of baptism. But the greatest of those is love, because love will last forever. Faith will go away. You and I are here tonight because we have faith in God, and we believe that God is here. We believe his body and blood is in this Eucharist, and that's faith. And hope, we know that God promised that he would be with us till the end of time, so we know that each day he walks with us, and we know that in hope that we will rise from the dead one day. That's hope, but those will be gone once we're in heaven. But what will be in heaven is love, and God is love. So we'll be united with him totally. And so it's important for us to cultivate that kind of love in our lives, love for God and love for one another. The gospel can be a little confusing. The first couple of lines were the last lines of the gospel last week. And Jesus is in his hometown with his relatives and friends and all those who knew him growing up. And he makes that profound statement that he's the anointed one, the Christ. And we ended the gospel last week with them sitting there kind of in silence and awe. But then it changes so quickly. They start thinking about it. He's Joseph. His dad's a carpenter. And so he was not a learned man, he was a laborer. And so he would not have been learned enough to preach or teach. And yet he's teaching and preaching. In fact, even more than that, he's claiming that he's the Messiah. And so they become angry because they think he's blaspheming. And they rise up against him and they chase him, and they right to the edge of town. They want to throw him over the cliff. How horrible for Jesus. He's doing what is right and preaching the truth, and they want to drive him away. That's the suffering of Christ. It makes me think about what's the meaning for us. When they said, when Jesus said they were thinking, why haven't you done these miracles in your native place like you did at Capernaum? They're really thinking, why don't you do those miracles for us? Don't we say the same thing? Don't we want God to do what we ask him to do? And don't we say, well, if I'm following Jesus and I'm being faithful, then he should do what I want? But it never seems to work that way, does it? He does what he wants. And we find things like when bad things happen to good people and good things happen to bad people. And we say, this isn't fair, but it happens, and it happened to Christ. He would suffer to the point of being crucified on the cross. But we need to remember the end result of his fidelity was resurrection from the dead. And you and I have that same goal and that same promise. And so the Lord just needs us to trust him in good times and bad. We need to trust him. and know that he's leading us always to a final conclusion that will be happy for eternity. So there's a lot to think about in the scriptures tonight. And we ask God to help us, fill us with a sense of truly being his light in the world, of doing what he wills. There's so many things happening out there in the world that are so disturbing, aren't there? So many things in the news every day, things that we all worry about and wonder about. And it's a time for us to really trust God and to pray for our country, to pray for the morality, to pray for the justice that needs to take place, the respect for human life. If human life is formed deliberately in a mother's womb, then we have to honor that and respect that. But this week's rulings in New York are just horrible, with allowing abortion just prior to birth. That would be murdering an infant. It would be infanticide. And yet it's becoming legal. So it just gets worse. So we need to pray about that, first of all, so that people will change their minds and turn their hearts to what is true and what is good and what is right. And we need to support that. And so we need not be discouraged or give up, because the Lord told us, I'm with you always. So even in the midst of all these difficulties we see and political unrest and all the things that are happening, we need to continue to pray and trust that God is with us. He will be with us. At the end of the Mass today is also the Feast of St. Blaise. And tomorrow the 3rd? Yeah, that's Feast of St. Blaise. So I'll give the blessing of throats. But you might say, well, I got my throat blessed last year, and the next day I got a sore throat. The blessing is not going to miraculously preserve you from every sore throat. But the blessing is to remind us that St. Blaise performed a miracle. There was a young boy who was choking on a fish bone, and he couldn't breathe. And he came across, and he took the boy, and he healed him. And he stopped choking. And so that's where the blessing begins. God is concerned with us both physically and spiritually. And so when we ask a blessing from him for physical health, he listens and he will help us. He will give us the ability to be physically well. He cares about that. But he also cares about us spiritually, so that if we do become ill, we have the spiritual strength to endure it until we heal. So the blessing has multiple benefits for us. So we'll receive that blessing at the end of Mass today.